Ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a park ranger. Maybe it was the idea of being a hero to some lost tourists or trapped cavers. Or maybe I just realized from a very early age that I wasn't cut out for work in an office. I needed to feel the sun on my back and the breeze in my hair, to look out over a great expanse of wilderness and not see a single trace of human civilization. Or so I thought back then. Hell, maybe I just thought the uniform looked cool. In the end, the reasons don't matter. As sure as water flowing downstream, I was set on the course that led me here, to the Arl National Forest. That isn't the real name of this place, but it will have to do. What's important is that we're talking about nearly 2.5 million acres of land bordered by nothing but dusty two-lane roads and dying small towns. Tourists mostly come in just 3 times a year: spring break, midsummer, and a few weekends in October for the fall colors. During the rest of the year, the local economy depends on a trickle of vacationing families and rugged backpackers. They rent the kitschy log cabins, buy ice and beef jerky from the general store, eat at Molly's Greasy Spoon Diner on the park border, and occasionally get hurt or go missing. And that was where Leroy and I came in. This was my first position with the Park Service, whereas Leroy had been working in the Arl National Forest for years. When we first met at the cabin that would become my family's new home, the difference between the two of us was striking. Leroy wore his rugged khaki outfit like he'd been born in it, and he moved with the quiet confidence of a man whom life held no more surprises. I, on the other hand, had gotten turned around on the back roads and arrived late, even though I had left early. My wife Tracy had spent the drive looking skeptically out at the endless forest, while our 4-year-old daughter, Emma, was throwing a tantrum in the back seat because her bag of chips was the wrong color. By the time the little wooden cabin appeared around a bend in the gravel road, I felt tense enough to snap. Leroy didn't even turn around as we pulled up the gravel driveway. He stood on the small hill beside the cabin, watching the woods. If he noticed how nervous I was, he didn't seem to care. He just smoothed out his thick gray beard, shook my hand, and gave me the keys like he couldn't wait to be gone. Once Leroy saw my wife and daughter climbing out of the SUV, however, his attitude changed. He wanted to know what the hell they were doing here. He'd specifically requested that the ranger sent to this post be a single man without any family ties. When I gently reminded him that hiring requirements like those were discriminatory, he just snorted and waved us inside. Suddenly, Leroy wanted to stick around and give us a grand tour. The cabin had been built in the 70s, and it showed. The walls were yellow pine, the floors were covered in puke green carpet, and the brown linoleum in the kitchen was peeling. Leroy gestured around the place as if to say, "This is what you get when it's paid for by the government." What he really wanted to show us turned out to be a backup generator and the floodlights. The cabin had well water and a septic tank, but was hooked up to the grid for power. The problem was that ice, a windstorm, or even a fallen tree could knock it out for days. Leroy patiently explained how to set up the generator and use it to run the lights. They needed to be kept on all night, he insisted, no exceptions. I told him that sounded to me like a waste of money. He told me that I should learn to keep my mouth shut and do as I was told. If I gave him just one little reason, Leroy warned me, he would send me and my little family packing. With his tour finished, Leroy handed me a map of the park, a schedule, and a bag containing my work uniform. The rest of my issued equipment was waiting for me at the ranger station, 15 miles to the south. Leroy would see me there the next morning. If I survived the night, he smirked. I wasn't completely sure that he'd meant it as a joke. On his way out the door, Leroy stooped down in front of Emma and glared at her with his flinty gray-blue eyes. I moved protectively toward my daughter, but she didn't run to me like she usually did when strangers interacted with her. Instead, she waited patiently for whatever the old man had to say. "Hey, kid," Leroy began. "Your daddy ever talk to you about how to stay safe in the woods?" Emma nodded. "What did he say?" "Stay where an adult can see you. Don't touch plants and animals you don't know, and if you get lost, sit down and scream. I was proud of my girl, but Leroy said nothing. Then he added, and don't go outside after dark, right? Emma nodded again. Leroy ruffled her feathery blonde hair and walked out of the living room, letting the rusty screen door slam behind him. It was a hell of a welcome to my new job, and as it turned out, it was just the beginning of what the Arl National Forest had in store for me. Our SUV was stuffed to bursting, not only with everything we needed for the move, but also with groceries. The nearest real grocery store was almost an hour away, and Tracy had insisted that we stock up. By the time we finished unpacking, the sun had set. All we wanted was to eat some hot soup and crawl into bed. Only Emma had any energy left. While Tracy and I ate in exhausted silence, she swung her feet and sang along to a tune that, for all I knew, she had invented herself. I had just stretched and announced that it was time for bed when she sprang out of her chair and gripped my hand. "The lights!" Emma shouted. I didn't know what she was talking about at first, until I remembered Leroy's commandments about keeping the house illuminated after dusk. Outside the cabin windows, the night seemed as black as the bottom of the ocean. If I flicked the switch on now, what might I see? Pushing thoughts of pale, grinning faces and tall, spindly things with too many legs out of my mind, I did as my superior had asked. Suddenly, the small yard around the cabin was as bright as day. The forest branches were bone white in the blazing light. I thought I could even hear the electricity hum. Nothing moved outside, not even a squirrel. What, I wondered again, was the point of all this? To serve as a marker to anyone lost in the woods? To frighten away wild animals, thieves, or something else? I was too tired to care. Leroy had been right all along, I realized. What did it matter what the lights were for? I wasn't paying for them, and turning them on was apparently just another part of my job. After a final look out the window, I closed the blinds and went to bed. When I arrived at the ranger station the next morning, Leroy was having coffee with Betty Brock, a 50-something Native American woman who was sheriff of one of the dying counties that bordered the park. I recognized her from the Re-elect Sheriff Betty campaign signs that I'd seen everywhere on our drive-in. I had to hand it to her. She was persistent. To get elected sheriff as a woman out here, I figured you had to be. "This is Brett McCammon," Leroy said. "He's going to be the new deputy ranger around these parts. Him and his family just moved in yesterday." There it was again, that weird emphasis on my wife and child. The sheriff and Leroy exchanged a dark look, but before I could ask what it was about, she offered me some of the donuts she brought. I turned her down, admitting I was trying to watch my carbs. Sheriff Betty just laughed, then told me I'd regret it, and she was right. Leroy put me through my paces that morning. I never imagined that a pot-bellied old man would be able to move so fast. While Sheriff Brock minded the comms at the ranger station, Leroy took me on a hike to the most critical trouble spots in the Arl National Forest, the clifftop overlook where people kept falling while trying to take a selfie, the narrow ravine that always got hit with flash floods after a heavy rain. The sight that chilled me the most was a deceptively calm creek near a busy picnic area. It was connected to a series of cave systems, and beneath its smooth, dark surface, the water flowed fast and cold. Every year, a few families ignored the no swimming signs. As a result, they never saw their children again. Leroy and I peeled off our boots and plunged our aching feet into the refreshingly cold water. Just as he'd said, the current was deeper and faster than expected. "There's one other thing you should know," Leroy added. "Rabies has been a problem out here for a while. State University sends researchers every now and again. So far, whatever they're doing hasn't done jack to solve our problem. So if you see any of the wildlife acting strangely, just keep your distance. Okay?" I thought back to what I taught Emma. Don't touch plants and animals you don't know, and a shiver went up my spine. At dusk, we drove back to the ranger station in Leroy's ancient, dusty truck. On the way, he told me that I'd kept up better than he'd expected. "You just might be able to hack it out here after all," he said. I took it as a compliment. We were about to turn into the station when a massive black shape bolted across the road. Leroy threw on the brakes, cursing. We skidded to a halt in a cloud of burning rubber. The thing that had cut in front of us, however, was already gone. When I asked Leroy what it was, he said he thought it might be a bear, but that wasn't what it looked like to me. Its limbs had been too long, its body too emaciated and stretched. It hadn't looked like any animal I'd ever seen. If it was a bear, I joked, it must have been a hungry one. Leroy didn't laugh. He kept drumming his fingers on his service weapon while we closed down the station and locked the gate. By the time I began my drive back to the cabin, his nervousness had infected me as well. The darkness beyond my headlights felt infinite. I kept expecting that thing to run out in front of my SUV. If it did and caused an accident, who could I call? There wasn't much cell service out here, and even if there was, what if the thing didn't die? What if it stuck its jaws through the shattered windshield of my car and started trying to feed that horrible hunger? I told myself to stop it. I was driving faster than usual, eager to get home and make sure that whatever that thing had been, it wasn't in the living room of the cabin, feasting on my family. As I turned the corner of the gravel road, I was relieved to see that the floodlights were on. Tracy and Emma didn't understand why I was so upset. They'd had a great day decorating Emma's bedroom, exploring the yard around the house, and making homemade pizza for dinner. Maybe it was just first-day jitters. Maybe that thing in the road really had just been a starving black bear. The thought didn't make me feel any safer. I could tell Tracy and Emma were concerned, so I did my best to put on a brave face, to laugh and joke around the dinner table like usual. Fake it till you make it, I told myself. And by the time we got around to doing the dishes, I felt like myself again. The place and situation might have changed, but we were still the same happy family we'd always been. All it took was a single phrase spoken by my daughter as she looked out the rear window to shatter that illusion. "Daddy, there's a man with antlers in our backyard." I set down the plate in my hand and hurried to her side. The tree line, however, was just as barren as always. Had she seen a deer or something? I knew that kids often let their imaginations run away with them, especially in new environments. But after the day I'd had, it was the last thing I needed to hear. "Are you sure, honey?" I asked. Emma had already moved on to something else, making her Barbie fly through the air like Superman. She just looked up at me and shrugged. So much for the man with antlers, I thought. But even after an exhausting day and a hot shower, I struggled to fall asleep. In my dreams, I was being hunted down the now familiar trails of the Aral National Forest by a bright-eyed black beast that looked like something out of a medieval painting of hell. Cartoonish no-swimming signs glared down at me from the skeletal trees as I ran. I could see Sheriff Brock up ahead, standing with her back to me. When I spun her around to warn her about the beast, I saw that she had been dead for a while now, her head hacked off and replaced by that of a deer. The rotting animal's bloated purple tongue wriggled. Maggots dribbled down its chin onto my boots. The sheriff's corpse held out a rectangular pink box. "Hey, new guy," the deer head said in a gravelly voice. "Want a donut?" I woke, drenched in a cold sweat. Tracy was snoring softly beside me. It was 4 a.m. Only 3 hours left until my shift started at the ranger station. Knowing full well that I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep, I tiptoed into the kitchen to make coffee and a bowl of oatmeal. I looked out the window at the floodlit woods while I ate. Of course, there was nothing out there. What else had I expected? Leroy and I worked in turns, only seeing each other at the ranger station for a few hours at the beginning or end of a shift. We'd give a report on the day's incidents. There were usually none. Chat a bit about the weather, then go our separate ways. We also rotated who was on call overnight. Since I had a family to take care of, Leroy generously took 5 nights per week while I only took 2. Not that any calls ever came in, but still, it was a relief knowing I wouldn't be dragged out of bed because of some drunken college kids who had set their tent on fire. On my drive home that Friday evening, I caught a glimpse of a long, dark shape loping along the side of the road. Despite being encased in the protective steel cage of my SUV, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Was this the thing we had almost crashed into on my first day? As I slowed down, I realized that it was no horror movie monster. It was a very large, very wet stray dog. It watched me pass by with mournful, golden eyes, as though hoping I might have a spare T-bone steak to toss out the window. I considered stopping, then remembered Leroy's warning about rabies and changed my mind. "Sorry, buddy," I thought as it disappeared from the rear view. Better luck next time. Maybe it was that unexpected encounter which gave me another bout of insomnia that night. It wasn't until the azure sky began getting brighter that I finally switched off the lights, disgusted, and sat down to doze in a saggy green armchair. Annoying, I thought, how those branches kept scratching against the window panes. I needed to trim them back this weekend. I sat up with a start. There were no trees that close to the cabin. I rushed to the wall and slammed on the floodlights. The yard was empty, but there were a pair of large, greasy handprints on the living room window. Even worse were the scratches above them, just the sort that could have been made by a pair of antlers scraping against the glass while something tried to open the latches. Vagrants? A prank? Something even more sinister? I washed off the filth before Tracy and Emma woke up and decided not to mention what I'd found. I didn't want to scare my family before I knew what I was dealing with. But I did remind my wife where I kept my spare service weapon and its ammunition. I was more concerned about Emma, who loved the woods and played near them every chance she got. It stormed all that weekend, but I can't say that I minded. It gave me an excuse to keep Emma inside. By Sunday afternoon, all of us were going stir-crazy inside the cabin, so we put on our rain gear and took a walk along the edge of the forest. I should have been relieved to get out of the house, but I couldn't relax. I kept imagining some horrible creature lurching out of the undergrowth to drag my child away. Emma, oblivious, splashed through the puddles in her knee-high rain boots. She had gotten a short distance ahead of me when she let out a shriek, slipping in the muck and wet grass. I came running only to discover that she was excited about having seen a salamander. The weather was an omen of things to come. The days were getting shorter, the nights cooler. The weather was damp and overcast by the time the leaves began to change. I thought I had a handle on my role at the Ural National Forest. Even Leroy seemed begrudgingly proud of me. On the last Friday in September, the weather was beautiful again, like a last gasp of summer, and Leroy dropped by the station to send me home early. "I'll take over," he said kindly. "Take the wife and kid for a spin around the park this weekend. Show them there's more to this place than just mud and rain." I drove home with the setting sun at my back, the wind in my hair, and the radio blaring. I was excited to share the good news with my family. Twirling the keys in my hand, I skipped up the driveway and snuck around to the cabin's backyard, where I was sure Emma would be playing. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. Emma wasn't alone. Despite the twilight gloom, I could clearly see that she was playing with a large, dark-haired dog. I recognized those sad, golden eyes. It was the same animal I'd seen loping along the road. When I approached, it gave Emma's hand one final lick and bounded off into the woods. Tracy waved at me from the cabin window where she was drying dishes. Furious, I barged inside. Tracy didn't understand why I was angry. The dog had been coming by for weeks now, she said, and it had taken to Emma right away. It didn't have a collar, but it wasn't mangy or sickly looking. And as far as aggression was concerned, she'd never heard it so much as bark. Emma didn't have any playmates out here, Tracy reminded me, and the company was doing her good. My wife put a hand on my shoulder. It was fine, she insisted. Emma was right here in the backyard, and from the kitchen, she could keep an eye on her the whole time. I wasn't convinced, but I also didn't want to separate my daughter from her new friend. If I drove the dog away for no good reason, I was sure that Emma wouldn't understand. Besides, my wife was watching, and if she noticed any unusual behavior from the animal, she could get Emma to safety right away. Confident in my decision, I spread a map out across the rickety kitchen table and started planning our excursion through the park. We left the cabin Saturday morning at dawn and didn't return until nightfall, worn out from all the walking and sunshine. The day had been just as perfect as Leroy had promised. I'd introduced Tracy and Emma to all my favorite spots, including some hidden ones that I doubted more than a handful of people could find. We'd splashed in creeks, scrambled up mossy rocks, and peered over the edges of waterfalls. And now all three of us were ready for bed. While Tracy unloaded the SUV, I made straight for the cabin. The sun was setting earlier every day, and I scolded myself for not having been home to turn on the floodlights. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard a sort of snort. It seemed to come from right behind me, and was exactly the sort of huffing sound a deer might make. Almost as a reflex, I shoved open the door, stuck my hand inside, and slammed on the light switch. When I turned around, though, all I saw was Emma staring at me from the back seat. "Didn't look happy to see you, Daddy?" Emma commented later that night as I helped her change into her pajamas. "Who, honey?" I asked. "Man with the antlers." My blood ran cold, but I finished putting Emma to bed before rushing to talk with Tracy. My wife was curled up in the sagging green armchair, sipping tea with a blanket on her lap, another sign of cold weather coming. When I asked her if she had seen anyone standing around the cabin, however, she just looked confused. Tracy had been struggling with a cooler full of melted ice and hadn't even looked up until Emma and I were already inside. She wanted to know if anything was wrong. I told her that I wasn't sure. How could I explain what I'd been noticing lately without sounding insane? Only one thing was clear. Whatever was happening in the Aral National Forest seemed to be targeting me and my family. And to make matters worse, it seemed to be escalating. What would I find next time? Emma's man with antlers standing over me as I slept? The floodlights apparently played a role in keeping whatever it was at bay, but I needed more information. It was time for me and Leroy to have a little chat. As it turned out, that was easier said than done. When I arrived at the ranger station the next Monday morning, I found Sheriff Betty Brock, not Leroy, waiting for me. She had come bearing bad news. The night before, emergency services had received a call from someone claiming to be a wounded hiker. The ranger station was nearest to the scene, and Leroy, the only one on duty that night, had sprung into action. When he hadn't checked back in by dawn, 2 deputies were sent down the trail he'd taken. They had found Leroy lying unconscious at the bottom of a ravine. It wasn't clear exactly what had happened, but it had rained overnight, and it was possible that he had slipped on the same slick, steep trail where the hiker had supposedly been injured. His head wound was severe, and the lower temperatures brought on by the rain put him at risk for hypothermia. Leroy was a tough old bastard, Sheriff Brock admitted, but he didn't exactly take care of himself, and the outlook wasn't good. He'd been taken to a hospital 2 hours away for treatment, but remained in a coma. Just a tragic accident, maybe. But from there, things started to get strange. Less than an hour before Sheriff Brock's visit to the ranger station, a woman named Hannah Malik had come in about her missing son, Tyler. He and 2 of his friends had left for a backpacking trip on Friday, and she hadn't heard from him since. It worried her, especially considering that her son was constantly on his phone. When Sheriff Brock ran his information, she discovered that Tyler's number was the same one that made the emergency call the night before. When she replayed the call for his mother, however, her face went pale. The garbled, gravelly voice on the other end of the line sounded nothing like her son. Despite the bizarre circumstances, my training kicked in. Apparently, we had 3 missing teenagers on our hands. Before I could make any preparations, Sheriff Brock held up a hand. "The boys are fine," she told me. They had gotten home late that afternoon, not suffering from anything worse than a few scratches and a bad hangover. When she'd asked Tyler about the distress call, however, he had no idea what she was talking about. He'd lost his phone on their first day out. I asked Sheriff Brock what she thought it all meant. She told me to pour myself a cup of coffee and sit down. This place wasn't always called the Aral National Forest, Betty sighed. In the language of my people, it has a different name, an old and wicked name, a name that means red waters. In those days, we made our living as fur traders. Pelts were valuable, and the settlers wanted access to the territory where we trapped and hunted. They didn't dare risk open war. There were too few of them and too many of us. And we knew the land too well. Then their leader, a man called James Errol, proposed a trade. In exchange for a season's supply of furs, the children of our chieftains would be sent to a school downriver where they could learn the settlers' ways. It was a trap. All who attended the meeting were killed, hideously, even the infants. And the place where all that butchery happened? It's now a picnic area. You've heard how the creek is connected to a cave system, right? She asked. Our people say that the tribe learned of the massacre when they saw their family members' bloody, shattered bodies rising up from the stream. Red waters. Get it? Of course, all that's ancient history. What isn't is what happened next. The chief had brought his youngest children to the exchange, but left his 3 eldest behind, 2 boys and 1 girl. The 3 of them swore revenge at any cost. Legends say that they offered their souls to the spirit that dwelt in the caverns below, if only it would grant them the strength to bleed Errol and his people until there was nothing left. There are some who believe the spirit took the deal. The trio became immune to hunger and thirst, to exhaustion and cold, and to any mortal weapon. They say they had the strength of wild beasts, that they could change their shape, see in darkness as though it were daylight, and appear and disappear at will. With such powers at their disposal, it wasn't long before their vengeance was complete. The settlers' records claim that James Errol and his family were attacked by a pack of starving wolves and eaten alive. As you can imagine, in my people's tradition, the story is a little different, but the conclusion is the same. If it was wolves that killed the Errols, they must have been strange animals indeed. See, they stripped the flesh from the Errols' bones until there was nothing left, but kept their faces perfectly intact, staring up in terror at the winter sky. It was only afterward that the siblings understood the awful price they would pay for their victory. Even the people they had avenged now shunned them, sickened by their powers and by how they supposedly maintained them. There were rumors about secret rituals, about the consumption of human flesh. The trio came to hate the light. They withdrew to damp, dark places where no human eyes could witness the extent of their gruesome transformation. There they wait, lonely and hateful as ghosts, until their hunger drives them back to the surface. Or so they say. Sheriff Brock downed what was left of her coffee, slammed her mug on the desk, and looked disappointedly at the empty donut box beside it. She stood and strode over to the huge map of the park on the wall, running her fingers across its elevation lines as she spoke. If only there was some kind of pattern. If we just knew where or when they were going to strike, it would be different. We could close off sections of the park, shut down on certain days of the year. But they're totally unpredictable. Almost as unpredictable, you might say, as a massacre. Of course, certain times and places see more activity than others, she continued. As you might have guessed, they avoid bright light. They only move around at dusk, after nightfall, or during truly bad weather. That's probably what saved Leroy. The clouds broke and the sun came up before they could finish the job. The creek, the cliff top, the ravine. Those are the worst areas. How many of those supposedly missing kids do you think got dragged down by a cold hand beneath the water? How many of those hikers fell to their deaths while running from something inhuman? You probably took what Leroy told you about the accidents and disappearances at face value, didn't you? Didn't even bother to look up the statistics behind them or notice how excessive they seemed to be. Sandra, your predecessor, wasn't like you. She was meticulous, a go-getter, a real white knight. She'd spent some time overseas in the military, and she thought that qualified her to handle our little problem once and for all. She said she had a theory about where the trio hibernated, and she wanted Leroy and me to go in with her, along with all the firepower we had. I'm a politician, not a soldier, and old Leroy has seen too much to imagine that they could be stopped. We turned her down, so she went in alone. Officially, your predecessor abandoned her post. Unofficially, Leroy found her body stretched between two trees on the cliff top. Just like with James Errol, they'd stripped the meat from everything except her face. The pair of us gave her a decent burial. You'll have to forgive me if I don't tell you where. Sheriff Brock turned, scanning my face for a reaction. Thunder rumbled. I peeked out the window. It was too late in the season for a summer storm, but the dark, towering clouds on the horizon didn't appear to have gotten the memo. Does the legend say that one of those three siblings can transform into a deer? I asked carefully. The eldest brother? Betty nodded. They say he valued speed above all things. The youngest, who valued strength, could transform into a bear. And what about the sister? A bitter smile crept across the sheriff's face. She was more clever. She chose an animal that was both quick and strong, but that would also appear unthreatening to humans. They say she could take on the form of a large, dark-haired dog. I was sprinting to my SUV before I even knew what I was doing. "Emma!" I shouted, not sure who I was addressing. The sheriff? The horrors in the forest? God? Under the circumstances, any of them would have made sense. I peeled out of the parking lot, startling a family of 4 who were packing away their picnic in anticipation of the storm. Sheets of iron-gray rain began falling from the sky. Betty Brock's words echoed in my ear. They only move around at dusk, after nightfall, or during truly bad weather. It was still mid-morning, but I figured this storm would qualify. I wanted to be wrong. I just didn't think that I was. I called Tracy's number frantically as I drove, but the phone kept slipping in and out of service. Like always. Previously, the bad reception had been annoying. Now it might be deadly. I was driving like a maniac, far too fast for those winding mountain roads, even if the conditions had been perfect. I skidded around corners, sloshing waves of water. The steering wheel felt loose and useless in my hands, but I didn't dare slow down. I checked my phone, hoping one of my calls had gotten through. No such luck. A sound as loud as a freight train whistle jolted my attention back to the road. I had drifted into the opposite lane, and a logging truck was heading straight for me. I slammed the wheel hard to the right, fishtailing onto the shoulder, but managing to avoid a crushing death by a few inches. My knuckles were white on the wheel, my breathing ragged, but I aimed my tires back at the road and kept accelerating. Through the curtains of water, I could see red and blue lights behind me. Sheriff Brock. She wasn't here to pull me over, I realized. She had come to provide me with an escort, to make sure I reached the cabin as quickly as possible. The rain was so heavy, though, I doubted her flashing lights would make any difference. I had never seen such a storm. Branches swayed and cracked in the wind. The windows of the old general store, the only other structure between the ranger station and the cabin, had gone dark. That could only mean one thing. The power was out. Would Tracy know to turn on the floodlights, even though it was still technically daylight? Would she remember how to use the gas-powered generator? Everything depended on the answer. As I turned up the gravel driveway, my fears were confirmed. Battered by the storm, the lightless cabin looked abandoned. There was no sign of any deer-headed monster or any ravenous bear-like thing. But that might have been because they were already inside. I ran to the cabin, leaving the engine running. A dark shape shifted on the other side of the screen door, almost like it was waiting for me. "Go on! I'll cover you!" Sheriff Brock shouted out the window of her cruiser. She threw on a rain slicker and drew her sidearm. "What's wrong?" Tracy asked through the screen door. It was her, of course. She must have come to the door when she heard us coming. "There's no time to explain. Where's Emma?" I gasped. "She's in the kitchen, playing with Coco." "I'm sorry. I know you said not to, but we gave the dog a name. We actually brought her inside. Coco's behaving great, and she just looked so wet and miserable out in the rain." I pushed my wife aside and ran to the kitchen, or tried to. I was still unfamiliar with the cabin, and with no illumination, it felt like a different place entirely, like something out of a nightmare. I slipped on Emma's toys and crashed into the furniture. Gunshots rang out behind me. Despite the danger ahead, instinct made me glance over my shoulder. The gaunt monstrosity lumbering toward Sheriff Brock looked less like a black bear and more like a child's nightmare drawing of one. Her bullet sank harmlessly into its matted, rain-drenched fur. A child's high-pitched shriek broke through my fear and reminded me why I was here: to protect Emma. "You're not my friend," my daughter was screaming. "You're not a doggy at all." In the kitchen, a wild-haired figure rose from the floor, the gloomy light streaming through the window reflected in its golden eyes, and on its sharp, horribly dog-like teeth. Its fingers, multi-jointed and many times too long, stretched toward a knife on the countertop. And then everything became blindingly, unbearably bright. The generator rumbled, its noise briefly drowned out by an inhuman wail from the kitchen. The window shattered as a twisted form, neither entirely human nor entirely canine, flung itself backward through it. I looked to the living room, where my wife stood over the generator, panting. For a brief second, I caught a flash of another figure standing behind her, a tall, muscular man with a deer's head. It held a tomahawk to her neck, nicking it just enough to draw blood. Then it flickered and was gone. Tracy's hand flashed to her throat. It came away stained red. Did something bite me?" she asked. I didn't know how to respond. Emma sat on the kitchen floor amidst broken glass, shaken but unharmed. The screen door swung open, making us all jump. "A few more seconds and this place would have needed a new ranger and a new sheriff," Betty Brock grumbled. "What was that thing?" Tracy wondered. "A bear," I said. "I guess you could say that." I checked the gas reserves. Even if the power stayed out, we had enough to keep the generator running for a long while. I felt like laughing, like celebrating. But I soon learned the same harsh lesson those three cursed siblings had so many years ago. Victory always comes with a price. When Sheriff Brock got back in touch with her deputies, she discovered that Leroy's condition had taken a turn for the worse. As the clouds began to clear, we all piled into my SUV and followed her cruiser to the hospital. Even then, even before we knew, the drive felt like a funeral procession. Sheriff Brock went straight to the front desk to ask about Leroy. But as it turned out, I learned about his death before she did. A pair of orderlies passed by me in the hall, gossiping. "Poor bastard," one was saying. "He almost pulled through. And did you see the gashes in the back of his head? I mean, they almost looked like they were made by a tomahawk." I don't expect anyone to believe this story, especially after I've changed so many of the names and dates. But if by chance you rent a cabin or go camping in one of our lovely national forests, do yourself a favor. Keep the lights on. "What do you know about Station 21? Asked Len Gibson, the grizzled old forest ranger who was driving me out to my new posting. I shrugged. "Not much. I spent most of my time with the Forest Service out west and just transferred to the East Coast recently. This is my first posting out here." He grunted, wrestling with the steering wheel of the old four-wheel drive pickup as it bucked over the unused trail, heavy underbrush and thick trees passing by, dangerously close on either side. The road was narrow, barely wide enough to accommodate the time-worn truck, and he was driving a bit faster than I was comfortable with. "I'm surprised they assigned rangers to it, though. Seems pretty remote," I said. "We've been driving for a couple of hours on this trail already, and the lonely stretch of paved road we'd left earlier was little more than a distant memory at this point. Used to be a fairly popular long hike trail that ran near it, and the department wanted to make sure that we had a presence out here in case anyone got in trouble," he said, never taking his eyes off the path ahead. It was a pretty technical trail. It was pretty common for city folk to underestimate the difficulty or the risk. I frowned briefly. "Used to be. It's not in use anymore." Gibson shook his head and spat out the open window. "Yeah, too many people were getting injured on it. When a couple of them went missing entirely, the department decided it was too dangerous to maintain it as a sanctioned trail. Let it go to seed. It's tough to even spot anymore unless you know what you're looking for. You'll find an old rope bridge near the cabin. That's about the only thing that'll let you know it existed at all. Then why maintain a posting here? I asked. He spared a quick glance at me and said, "You know the saying, if there's a station, there's a ranger. They'll probably get around to decommissioning it at some point, but for now." At that moment, we rounded a bend in the trail, and the station came into view. It was built to look like a rustic log cabin and was planted in the middle of a depressed area of the surrounding forest, the gentle ridges surrounding the area creating a natural bowl. The trees here were dense and somehow forbidding, and the unkempt limbs, heavy with gray tendrils of Spanish moss, reached over the cabin and crowded the edges of the modest clearing. The entire area was a lush green, heavily shadowed by the canopy above, and the air was thick with the scents of the deep bush. He used the open clearing to turn the truck around and stopped it in front of the wooden door emblazoned with the Forestry Service logo. Throwing it into park, he turned in his seat and looked at me expectantly. "Not staying a while?" I asked, opening my door and grabbing my overflowing duffel bag from the bed. "Nope," he said, shaking his head. "My job is to transport rangers in and out of their postings around here. Used to be that each ranger would have their own assigned vehicle, but the budget doesn't support that anymore." I stepped back from the truck and shut the door, throwing the duffel over my shoulder. "Where's the guy I'm relieving?" I asked, looking around. "That's Ed Marsh. Brought him out here a month ago, same as I brought you a week ago. The guy that does the supply runs came out here and found the station empty," he said, something unspoken behind his light gray eyes. "So what? He just disappeared?" I asked disbelievingly. The old ranger scratched a moment at the 3-day growth of white stubble on his cheek, as if trying to figure out how to phrase his answer. "Look, Miller, you seem like a nice guy. There aren't too many things in this area that'll threaten a man, aside from maybe a copperhead or the odd black bear, but neither of them are too common here. The truth is, some men just aren't built for the solitude and isolation up here. But Ed Marsh seemed solid enough, but he wouldn't be the first ranger to just up and leave his posting at Station 21. I took another glance around the area before turning back to Gibson, patting the bulging canvas slung over my shoulder. "Well, I got plenty of books to occupy my time. I brought my camera, so I expect I'll be able to add some really good shots to my portfolio." He paused a moment before ducking his head in an amiable nod and barking a laugh. "That's good, kid. Keep yourself busy, and the month will fly by. Before you know it, Elliot Barnes will be out here in a week to resupply you, but you should have plenty still in the cabin to carry you over." I nodded my thanks to him and stepped back from the pickup as he threw it into gear and headed back off the way we'd come. I watched the tan and maroon 4x4 until it was lost to view, the sounds of its whining engine lost to the trees. I found myself alone in front of the cabin, glad to be on solid ground after the morning's less than smooth ride out here. The sounds of nature, which had momentarily been muted when we arrived, slowly returned in force. The chittering of the squirrels and chipmunks somehow in harmony with the birdsong in the treetops. The air was cool and still as I stepped onto the wooden porch that spanned the front of the cabin. I turned the knob and pushed the door inward. The interior of the station was Spartan and neat, divided into a small office space for visitors and a slightly larger living space for the ranger. I walked around the low wooden counter and through the open doorway that led to my new accommodations for the next month. It was relatively neat and organized. The ranger who'd been posted here before me looked to have been fairly settled into his posting. I wondered briefly why a forest ranger accustomed to spending his time alone in the forest would decide one day to just pick up and leave. The trail back to the main road wasn't a difficult one to hike, but it was a long one. Of course, Ed Marsh had probably called a friend to come out and pick him up, but it still didn't make any sense. Regardless, it was a mystery for another day. The sun was beginning to set, and I still needed to get settled in and set for the night. By the time I had unpacked my stuff and started a fire in the cobblestone fireplace, Night had fallen. The silence of the woodlands around me was a familiar comfort, different from my previous post in the Pacific Northwest, yet somehow the same. The air began to chill with the coming of night, and I made my way around the cabin, locking the front door to prevent any curious critters from finding their way inside during the night. I left the windows open for a bit for the airflow and settled comfortably in a cushioned chair in front of the crackling flames with a bit of Johnny Walker I'd carefully packed, just enjoying the moment, lost in my thoughts. My eyes wandered aimlessly around the room, taking in my new surroundings. I stopped when they settled upon some crumpled pieces of paper that had been discarded and were hiding in the corner of the room near the bed. With a grunt of interest, I stood from the chair and took another swallow of the scotch, heading over and snatching the papers up from the floor. Returning to my seat in front of the fireplace, I set the glass on the low-end table to my right and smoothed the papers out on my knee. They looked like they had been torn out of a bound notebook, perhaps a composition book or journal, and the handwriting was in a sloppy cursive written in black ink. I raised my eyebrows in interest when I read the first page. Dropped off today by Ranger Gibson. Thought I was going to piss myself for the last half hour with the drive. I think he hit every rock and root on that trail. The old bastard tried to spook me with the history of Station 21, but I'm not a rookie. I know how things are for new postings. I have to admit that Station 21 is a bit of a mystery, but it just adds to the charm of the place. I'll have plenty of time to get familiar with it. I flipped to the next page. Some sort of animal was outside the cabin last night. I'm glad I thought to close the door. The last thing I want is to wake up to a black bear rooting around in my provisions. Amen to that, I thought. Another page. I swear to Christ, if that old bastard is trying to scare me, I'm gonna beat his ass. I don't have any interest in playing any games, and even less interest in going out in the middle of the night in the rain. I didn't think that Gibson seemed like the type of person to haze a new guy, but what did I know? I turned to the next page and kept reading. Okay, I'm not sure what the hell that was outside last night, but I don't think it was Gibson. There are no tire tracks anywhere nearby, and I can't find any boot prints in the mud this morning. Whatever it was too big to be a raccoon. Maybe a black bear, I guess. Need to be sure to keep things locked up. I'm starting to wish they issued rifles out here. The last page was the strangest of the bunch. I think I saw it today out by the ravine, but I think it saw me too. I don't think it likes it when you notice it because it sure took notice of me pretty damn quick after I spotted it. Need to be more careful. I reread the pages a few more times, pouring myself a bit more of the scotch and reclining back in the chair as I pondered what I had read. I must have drifted off at some point, because I awoke to the sound of rain and thunder. The fire had died down to embers, and a chill had replaced the comfortable warmth that it provided. I stood from my chair and walked over to the window, looking out into the dark at the rain. Even with the heavy cloud cover, I could still make out the dim shapes of the trees beyond the clearing in front of the cabin. A gust of wind rose and blew the misting rain into my face through the screen. Not wanting to have to spend the next morning trying to dry everything out, I began walking around all the windows and closing them, lamenting the loss of fresh air they permitted into the cabin's interior. I moved to the last window, the one nearest the main entrance to the ranger station, and froze. My brow creased and I squinted into the rainy darkness. I was sure I had seen a shape moving along the tree line, but lost it when the storm intensified briefly and obscured my view. Staring into the darkness for a long minute, I reluctantly backed away and closed the last window, shaking off the uncomfortable feeling as best I could before moving over to the bed and dropping into it without bothering to undress. Sleep quickly took me, and my dreams were filled with strange and unseen shapes hiding in the shadows at the edge of my awareness. By the time I rolled out of bed the next morning, all remnants of the previous night's unease had vanished, and my mood was heightened as I faced my first morning at my new post. After a quick breakfast and a change into a fresh uniform, I threw open all the windows before stepping out of the cabin and into the damp early morning air. I dug my camera out of its case and threw a strap over my head as I set out. The first thing I wanted to do was take a look around the area and get a sense of my surroundings. Gibson had told me there was an old rope bridge that led to the decommissioned trail nearby, and after a quick look at the area map in the ranger's office, I figured that it was only 100 yards or so north of the station. I figured that would be as good a place as any to start, and would probably provide some nice opportunities to get some dynamic shots. My narrow trail led into the tree line to my right as I stepped off the wooden porch and into the ankle-high grass of the clearing. A small sign with a white arrow was posted near the trail with a brief description: Graham's Ravine. With a spring in my step, I followed the narrow trail through the trees, embracing the sense of nature that surrounded me. The constant dripping of the previous night's rainwater joined its voice to the native fauna and seemed to push me along. Before long, I emerged from the trail and found myself standing at the edge of a jagged cliff. The grassy ground abruptly gave way to a rocky vertical face that tumbled down nearly 100 feet to the floor of the ravine below. The base of the gulch was filled with the angry flow of a narrow river, though I suspected that it was likely the storm from the night before that made it so. It was probably ordinarily little more than a meandering creek when the weather was dry. Spanning the ravine was an old and weather-worn rope suspension bridge with gap-toothed wooden planks beckoning for travelers to cross. They didn't look too trustworthy, so I decided to keep my feet on solid ground for today. Perhaps I'd be a little braver another day and try my luck with the bridge. Instead, I raised my camera and removed the lens cap, bringing it up to my eye and taking several pictures of the scene, including one point-of-view shot looking across the bridge itself, as if the viewer were to step onto the span. I was pleased with that one. I felt it added a little drama to the rest. After a while, I replaced the lens cap and continued my exploration of the area surrounding the ranger station, eventually finding myself back at the cabin in the waning afternoon light. All in all, it had been a peaceful and pleasant day, and I'd wrap it up with some light chores around the station before calling it a day. That evening, I copied the images from my earlier outing to my tablet and was lazily swiping through them as I picked at my dinner. I reached the set I had taken at the rope bridge and smiled at them. They turned out better than I'd hoped. As expected, the POV shot across the span was the best of them. I wished I had thought to add a little more field of view for added drama, but I could take care of that with editing. I didn't think that would be necessary, though. I was sure I'd end up with hundreds of similar shots by the time I rotated out of this posting. Something in one of the shots of the bridge caught my eye, and I set my plate aside as I zoomed in closer on the image. In the foliage across the ravine, half hidden behind a tree, was what looked like a tall, impossibly thin man. He appeared to be leaning around the tree and staring directly at me. Thinking it must just be a trick of the light as it played upon the undergrowth, I checked the other pictures and gasped out loud, startled at what I saw. In each of the images taken at the ravine, the figure appeared. In the first view, it seemed to be moving slowly among the trees, oblivious to my presence. But then, suddenly, in the next frame, there it was, standing behind the tree and staring directly at my camera, at me. The man was tall. He must have been well over 6 feet and very thin. He appeared to be dressed head to foot in some sort of black cloak or cape, and only his pale, bald head and hands were otherwise visible. Most unsettling, however, were his eyes, which were unusually large and dark, like fist-sized black marbles set into his pale face. I couldn't really make out much more detail than that. He hadn't been the focus of my shot, and there was no way to enhance that area of the image any further. My attempts to zoom in more only succeeded in pixelating the image and obscuring the man. At first, I was more than a little shaken, But then I thought about it more and chided myself for being so easily startled. Sure, the encounter was an unusual one, but Gibson had told me the trail that lay beyond the ravine had been a popular one. Just because the Forestry Service had decided to stop maintaining it didn't mean that adventurous hikers didn't still travel it. That would also explain why the department wanted to maintain a ranger presence out here. If the trail was still being used, even unofficially, they would still want a ranger nearby in case of trouble. It all fit together nicely, and my nerves eased again. Still, a small glass of Johnny Walker was always welcome. So I started a fire and settled in for the night. During the light cleaning I had done that afternoon, I'd found another couple of crumpled pages behind the wastebasket and had set them aside on the end table to review later. Now, as I sat again before the crackling flames, I examined the 2 additional pages and felt the chill of dread climb from the base of my spine as I read the increasingly chaotic script. Something is outside the cabin again. Last night, it wasn't just hiding in the trees anymore. I feel like it's seen me, like it's taking notice of me now. I know how crazy that sounds, but it's the only way I can explain it. Elliot Barnes will be out here in 2 days to resupply me, and I'll leave with him when he gets here. They can find someone else to sit out here in this deserted ranger station. There's no need for any of us to be out here, and I don't think we belong here. I don't think it likes people being here. I don't think it likes to be noticed. I straightened from the hunched position I had unconsciously taken while examining the pages, stretching out the knot that had formed in the muscles of my neck as I stood and glanced over at the darkening windows that ringed the cabin walls. During the day, they provided welcome light and plenty of ventilation to the interior, but now, at night, they made me feel vulnerable. Anything could be outside, looking in at me through any of these windows, and I wouldn't know it. I could be surrounded by watchers on all sides and never have a clue. Get yourself together, for Christ's sake, I said aloud, shaking myself back to my senses. This was stupid. I had been in areas more remote and dangerous than this before. This was a posting they gave to rookie keepers, simple and safe, difficult to get into too much trouble here. That being said, I didn't hesitate to ensure the front door was locked and secured, and figured tonight I could sleep without the windows being open. Things would look a lot different in the morning. I was starting to agree with my predecessor. A rifle would have gone a long way to setting my mind at ease. Right about then, the rain came again that night, with less fury but greater volume. I tossed and turned in my sleep, never finding a comfortable position. In fact, it was less the mattress and more my imagination keeping sleep at bay. I couldn't coax my mind to quiet and calm itself in the darkness. It insisted on constructing sinister images to keep me awake. When I opened my eyes, it continued making the shapes of the furniture around me into alien and menacing forms. I turned over onto my side with frustration, forcing my eyes closed and focusing on the hissing sound of the rain on the metal roof above me. Normally, it would provide the perfect environment to lull me into a deep and restful sleep. But now it only served to mask the sounds of anything that might be sneaking around outside of the cabin. Stop it, I told myself angrily, opening my eyes, and I froze as my eyes fell upon the grotesque pale face at the nearest window, staring in at me with some detached and inhuman curiosity. The black eyes were huge and unmoving. Even as I watched, rivulets of rainwater streamed down its face and over them. I could see small tremors in the white skin of its face as it almost seemed to tremble minutely, as if it didn't have full control of its body. Involuntarily, I abruptly sat upright in my bed in shock, and without changing its blank expression, the face somehow seemed to grow agitated, heated. I don't think it likes to be noticed. Those words from Ed Marsh's pages floated into my mind, and I thought he might be right. In an instant, it had faded away from the window, leaving only blackness in its wake. Was it gone? Was it moving to another window? Was it waiting for me? It wasn't an animal, that much I could tell. If it was a man, I needed to understand what he wanted. If it wasn't a man, I needed to understand what it was. I couldn't stay here for another month with this thing haunting me every day and night, always wondering if and when it would come for me. What if I hadn't awoken when I had? Would it have grown bolder and come inside? I'm going out there. I don't have any weapons other than this can of bear spray, but I have to know. I can't just stay here and wait for it. I can't wait for it to wear me down from exhaustion and lack of sleep. If I'm going to confront it, it needs to be now. I wanted to write this all down before I went out there, just in case. I don't know what's going to happen or what's out there, but I need to know. Hopefully I'll have more information to update this journal in a while. Wish me luck. The preceding pages were discovered in a journal left by the forest ranger I was sent here to relieve. I can't find any trace of him other than his camera and some other personal effects, and the ranger that dropped me off said he just went missing one day. From what he was telling me, that's not exactly an unheard of occurrence at the station. Some people just can't handle the isolation. Reading his journal, it sounds like he was more than a little unhinged and experiencing hallucinations. I've long thought that the Forestry Service needed to institute psychological evaluations before they just send people into the wilderness in complete solitude. One thing that I can agree with my predecessor on, however, is that I need to keep the door locked at night. It sounded like something pretty big was moving around outside in the rain last night. I'm going to set some trail cameras tomorrow, I think, but if I hear it outside again tonight, I'll need to check it out. A man once paid me to be hunted for sport. I had stumbled across his post when I was browsing the web for work. I was looking for some sort of side gig to pass the time. I was at a bit of a crossroads in my life. I had quit my previous job to break away from the redundancy it had sucked me into. It was a spontaneous decision with no real-life planning. Luckily, in this day and age, the internet caters to people like me, people who don't care about chasing money or don't want to be tied down. It wasn't the money I was after, but the change it would provide. I felt like I couldn't enjoy anything in life, like I was just going through the motions. That night, I had been scrolling for quite some time, skimming over job posts. Help wanted here, shorthanded there. I didn't think I would find anything that would suit me. It all seemed like the same thing disguised under a different title. That was until I found this particular ad. I thought it was a scam at first. Comical dollar signs on each side of the Craigslist title, like a trap set for the elderly in search of credit card numbers. I clicked on it anyway, curiosity getting the better of me. In all caps, the posting read, "Big money for manhunt volunteers." At least it was to the point. The details below gave a brief introduction as to what the job entailed. I skimmed them over with amusement, half of me doubting if it was true, the other half kind of hoping it was. As ridiculous as the prospect was, I had to admit it was exciting. There were some requirements for the job, however, and I was surprised to find that I fit the bill. Must be male. Must be young and fit if possible. Must not be afraid of the dark. Must come alone. No cell phones, no firearms, no police. Must meet the night before to discuss further. The list went on for a while, but ultimately ended with a phone number and a typed signature from someone simply named Bob. I found myself thinking it over. I didn't exactly have anything to lose, no family or friends. I always lived alone. The idea of wanting to pack up at a moment's notice never seemed to sit well with any of the significant others I had in the past. I don't know if it was stupidity or the need for adventure, but in the end, I found myself grabbing my phone. I mean, how often do people get to say they were hunted for sport? The money wouldn't hurt either. I gave him a ring. The man who answered the call was tipsy but eager, and when I mentioned my interest in his post, he seemed to be ecstatic, like I was calling to give him the lead role in a movie. The conversation was a little awkward considering the reasoning behind the call itself, but after a few minutes of cryptic back and forth, we agreed on a meeting place. I was a few towns away, but he insisted I meet him closer to his side of the woods. The hunt would be at his estate, and I should stay in town so I was well rested for the event. We would meet at a local bar called the Sixth Shot to discuss terms and conditions. He seemed determined, like he had been waiting for someone for a while. He said he would understand if I was in no hurry, but with my current status of unemployment and lack of overall plans, I found myself meeting his energy. I had to admit the concept was a little exciting, if it was real at all. We decided to meet the next day. The Sixth Shot was a bustling little place. A neon sign with a smoking gun made it easy to find. When I arrived, I found the guy immediately. He looked about how you'd expect a manhunter to look. He pulled it off well. A black polo and tan cargos, a shiny shaved head with a thick curled mustache, all worn on a very tan and muscular body. He was sitting at the bar alone, and he lit up like a Christmas tree when he saw me. Like he knew. He patted the stool next to him like he was welcoming a long-lost friend. When I crossed the bar, I was met with a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder. He told me he was delighted to meet me, and drinks were on him. After a brief introduction, he got a glass of top-shelf bourbon for himself, while I sipped on an Irish red ale. I had acquired a taste for it recently. Considering he was trying to hire me with the intent to murder me, he sounded like a pretty cool guy. We got to know each other a little before getting to the serious stuff. The people around, enjoying their drinks, were none the wiser. The man known as Bob was actually Robert Callahan, a man born into a world of wealth and, as it seemed, perpetual boredom. His father ran a very successful chain of automotive stamping companies that he inherited from his grandfather. By the time his father passed, there were so many buildings and people assigned to making the gears turn efficiently across the globe without his input. He was able to live a life of leisure on a 7-figure income without as much as lifting a finger. The companies ran themselves as he got older, and he filled his adult years with seeking thrills across the globe. He tried anything that got his adrenaline pumping, from skydiving to whitewater rafting. He took a liking to hunting, which he said had started an escapade of finding the world's most dangerous predators and killing them, no matter the cost. He said he had seen it all, but in all his years, there was one thing he hadn't bagged: a human. I laughed at his extraordinary lifestyle, feeling a bit mundane when it was my turn to share stories. Mine was far from exciting. I left the more boring bits out, but I told him I spent most of my 20s as a park ranger. It kept me close to nature and the outdoors, but when it's all you look at, it tends to lose its luster. I left that to be a cab driver in a big city, something that kept me in transit and entertained for a while. Always moving, with so many people to observe in the busy city life. But in time, I found myself too contained to the city itself, which is why I recently quit. This brings me to about where I was right now, discussing being hunted by another man. He was fascinated, jotting down notes in a little pocketbook while he sipped his bourbon. We conversed for a time. I finished a couple of beers, and he ordered another pour of bourbon. The conversation was nice. It had been a while since the last time I went out with friends. Despite the fun I was having, we couldn't beat around the bush forever. When it came time to discuss the actual terms of our agreement, his face turned serious. I would be paid $5,000 tonight. Granted, I still wanted to go through with it. He said this would help me settle accounts before the event. He said he owned a mansion outside of town with over 30 acres of forest land. He was outside city limits. His nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. No one would hear screams or gunshots. We would start tomorrow night. I was supposed to get to his estate at 10 p.m. After my arrival, I would get 15 minutes to head into the forest as a head start. He explained when the 15 minutes were up, he would promptly signal with a flare. If I had any second thoughts, I needed to address them and withdraw from the woods before the signal. If I was still in the woods when the flare went off, I would be shot on sight. He said I would be paid $10,000 an hour if I survived. The hunt would go on until dawn, and if I was still alive come daybreak, I would be free. He would be armed with a hunting rifle and a combat knife. I would be armed with my wits. It was evident it wasn't in his plans for me to survive. But that was something I had already come to terms with. He studied my face when he said these things, perhaps trying to gauge my reaction. I tried my best to play it cool, despite being a little nervous. "Does any of this bother you?" he eventually asked, downing the last of his drink. "No, not really. I've always just tried to go with the flow. Doing that made me stumble upon your offer. Maybe if I get out and live a little, it'll encourage me to settle down for a bit more. That is, if I make it out alive." I winked, and we both had a laugh. "You're a riot. If I wasn't trying to kill you, I think we'd be pretty good friends." After all the details were ironed out, he paid the tab, and it was time for us to take our leave. We shook on it before going our separate ways. He was excited for the next day, a pep in his step carrying him to his obnoxiously lifted truck. He burned out as he left, almost rear-ending a Buick as he left the parking lot. I watched him go, feeling oddly serene in the cool night air. It was hard to describe. There was no one waiting for me to come back, no one to give me a courtesy call if I didn't show up. I didn't know if it was the thrill of the challenge or the drastic break in monotony. I spent my life trying not to be a creature of habit. Maybe this would be the last shift off course, or maybe tomorrow I would die and not have to worry about it anymore. With the moon shining bright and the cool breeze on my neck, I decided I would take a walk before sleeping in my car for the night. It might be my last time to enjoy a night like this. The next day, I woke in the backseat of my car, feeling oddly rejuvenated despite my choice of bed for the night. Through the blinding afternoon rays, I found my phone and checked my bank account. He was a man of his word. The $5,000 had been wired as promised. I decided I would go into town, indulge in some of the local variety, and find a place to shower before meeting Robert at the estate. I climbed into the front seat and left the parking lot, on my way into town. I called my landlord and canceled my lease. I was already living in and out of boxes, and my lease was month to month, so I wouldn't exactly be missed. After getting something to eat, I called and canceled all my utility accounts, electricity, internet, stuff like that. I had already put in my resignation at the cab company. There wasn't really any ties to my life at my apartment. I would either survive till dawn and get the biggest payday of my life, or not have to worry about the next step if I failed. Either way, this was the end of the current chapter of my life. After spending the day driving around town, I found myself heading over to Robert's property. The sun was already making its way into the horizon. His driveway was long and winding, leading to a gigantic house that looked like the surrounding forest was trying to swallow it. When I pulled up, it was already almost dark. A butler greeted me at the mansion, an old man carrying a silver tray covered in a soft cloth. He opened the car door and let me out, introducing himself only as Charles. "I will be taking your belongings now," he said. "If you don't make it out, they'll be destroyed at sunrise." He held out the tray. "Of course," I said, handing over my phone, wallet, and keys. After placing them on the tray, he offered a smile. "Would you like a refreshment before heading in? Mr. Callahan's staff will accommodate you before heading into the forest. He truly appreciates you answering his ad." "I'm fine. Thank you. I guess I'd rather just get to it," I said, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. "Of course. If you'll just follow me, it's right this way." He gestured for me to follow him. Charles escorted me through the house. The inside was furnished top to bottom with luxurious wooden furniture, bearskin rugs, chandeliers made of gold, and paintings from the Renaissance era. The estate was definitely worth a fortune. We passed by a trophy room filled wall to wall with mounts of animals from across the globe. They seemed to stare with their glass eyes, following us as we made our way through. Charles made no effort to engage in conversation, and neither did I. The other end of the mansion consisted of a large patio waiting for us. There was Robert, who seemed to be preparing for a little hunt. He was running a large combat knife over a whetstone slowly and methodically as we approached. Propped up next to him was a rifle, the bolt pulled back, several cartridges laid out on the glass table next to it, and the flare gun. "The time is approaching," said Charles, and Robert nodded. He wiped the blade off and sheathed it on his belt. I looked at his loadout on the table, starting to feel sick to my stomach. This was seriously happening. Now that I was here and seeing him fully prepared, I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. Robert stood and grabbed his rifle. He picked up each .308 cartridge and loaded them slowly, one at a time, until it was full. He racked the bolt forward, slung the rifle on his shoulder, and grabbed the flare gun. 15 minutes. Then flare, he said. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, twirling the flare gun on his finger. "No, not really," I said, making my way off the patio. I wasn't exactly sure what to say in a situation like this, so I figured it was best just to get going. "Excellent. I'll see you on the other side," he saluted me, and Charles gave me a nod. I turned and left the patio, making my way into the woods. Each step got heavier as I approached the trees, the darkness behind them getting eerier the closer I got. When I reached the tree line, I looked back at the mansion. Robert and Charles just watched expectantly. I swallowed and ducked in, feeling the full weight of my decision, perhaps a little too late. Once the mansion was no longer visible, I started jogging. I was mindful of my footsteps. A stray log or vine could trip me up. During my time as a park ranger, I spent dozens of hours hiking trails. I would survey the land weekly, picking up discarded things like trash and lost clothing. This landscape was much different, however. The ground was uneven, years of collecting leaves buried and fallen limbs and jagged rocks. I was wearing decent boots, but the terrain was unforgiving. One misplaced step, and I could roll or break an ankle. I wouldn't be able to rush too much, so I maintained a steady pace, hoping to put enough distance between us and maybe find a decent place to hide. With the sunset and no light source, I couldn't see very far in front of me. I tried not to think about how much time had passed. I just focused on pushing forward. The trees started to crowd, giant maples with lush branches blocking the moonlight. I ducked under them quickly. A twisted branch snagged my shirt, and I shook it loose. Birds screeched and roused from their perch, flapping away in a panic at my presence, their cries echoing into the night, sending a chill down my spine. There's nothing to be afraid of, I thought to myself. Not yet, at least. I came to a small clearing and took a second to catch my breath. I leaned on a tree, shaking clumps of mud and pine needles from my boots. The ground was wetter than I had anticipated. Off in the distance behind me, there was an echoing pop, and I looked to see the flare reaching toward the sky, a little orange ball of fire. I pushed off the tree and continued. I had to keep moving. I ran across the clearing, each step squished on the ground as I went on. My third stride. My boot stepped on something awkward and hard. By the time I heard the clicking sound, I knew it was already too late. The sudden force clamped down on both sides of my ankle. I could do nothing but cry in pain. I stumbled awkwardly to the ground, agony shooting through my leg as the wind was knocked out of me. I looked down at the bear trap, blood oozing from where the metal jaws were buried. I was frustrated at my foolishness. Of course, he had put traps in the woods. Why wouldn't he? I forced the jaws apart, the mechanism creaking, begging to bite down again. My hands shook, holding the slippery metal, and my leg was barely free. I let it snap shut. The sound of steel on steel clanked into the night, so loud it bounced off the trees. A second later, I heard an excited whooping noise. I'd heard him. He would be coming. I tried to see my ankle in the dark. There were nasty gashes on either side, but I didn't think it was broken. I got back up. It would hold weight. It was just hurting like hell. I didn't want to look back when I pushed forward, panic starting to set in, trying to regulate my breathing. I moved as quickly as I could, one strong step, one baby limp. I scanned the ground, looking for more traps. There had to be more, surely. Branches whipped my cheeks and pulled at my clothes. I tried to be more careful, but I just couldn't see them quick enough. My left foot squelched with every step, blood soaking through my sock into the laces. I pressed on, hurdling a large dead log. I had to find a spot to hide for a moment to catch my breath. My heart was racing. I was having trouble thinking rationally as I could with the situation. A wave of fear washed over me for the first time in a long time. I'd gotten what I wanted, a thrill to make me feel alive. But as I looked down at my mangled leg, I was starting to regret it. Gunfire cracked in the distance, branches next to my ear exploded, specks of bark and dust hitting my face from the racing bullet. I threw myself to the ground and started crawling, dragging my injured ankle with me. I dragged myself to a large pine tree and sat behind it, trying to come up with a plan. The gun went off again, closer this time. The round punched into the tree, shaking loose needles that fell from above. I squinted in the dark, trying to see ahead. In front of me, the ground started to slope, and I could finally make out the sound of rushing water. It could be a creek or a small river. Keeping behind the large pine, I slowly stood, trying to stick to the shadows until I was ready. I pushed off and started to run for the slope, hearing the gunfire again. As soon as I was in view, a fierce pain ripped through my shoulder, and my arm went limp, but I wouldn't stop. I started down the hill. I could see the shimmering surface of the creek below, something bobbing in the water, rotted logs from the looks of it. I needed to get down there, get under the water, and use the logs as cover. I worked my way down the slope. The ground was wet, each step threatening to slide out from underneath me. I heard footsteps now, breaking sticks and brushing trees as they tried to catch up. Another gunshot. The bullet whizzed over my head and missed. I tried to go down further and crouched, but my feet were too unstable. I focused on the water, a little bit closer and closer, like it was my salvation. I was almost there. Behind me, I could hear the racking of the bolt-action rifle. I shot a panicked look behind me. I could barely see him working through the trees, 20 yards away. As I turned back to the creek, my good foot got caught on something. I fell forward, hit the ground hard, and started to roll painfully and awkwardly in the dark. I watched my descent in a swirl of moonlight and darkness, my elbows and knees colliding with the earth as I went. I came to a stop at the edge of the water, lying on my back, gasping for air. I barely moved, my vision spinning as I looked up at the sky. I could hear him coming down the hill slowly and carefully. He knew he had won. He was taking his time now. Exhausted and defeated, I looked at the creek. It wasn't logs I had seen floating. Bodies. Several of them, bloating and rotting in the clear glow of the moon. I looked around. The more I saw, men, women, children. Robert was there now, boots squishing as he looked down at me. A pair of black goggles were over his eyes, a wicked grin on his face. He unslung his rifle and let it fall to the ground, then pulled the goggles off his face and cast them aside like toys. Disappointing. Very disappointing. I thought with you being a park ranger and all, you'd make it further. But here we are, at the creek. They never make it past the creek. Robert cracked his knuckles and pulled the knife from his belt. He held the knife in both hands and brought it down, aiming for my heart. I put up my hands to fight him, but it only delayed the inevitable. He worked free from my grasp and elbowed me in the head. My vision blurred once more. My arms went slack as he buried the knife in my chest. My lung collapsed as the blade went in, and with a grunt, he pulled the blade down, separating my torso down the middle in a nasty gushing mess. Satisfied, he got up and left me there to die. I tried to talk, but it all came out as gurgled whispers. What was that?" he mocked, and he knelt to hear me. With the last of my breath, I spoke my final 2 words, just loud enough for him to hear. Involuntary screams came next, loud and shrill, broken vocal cords shouting in a mixture of barking and screeching. With both hands, I pulled the large incision, yanking the flesh apart in a spray of blood and disintegrating organs. His reaction was the same as all others before him, a look of pure irrational fear. My thin, inky black limbs burst from the gaping wound in my torso. I was on him in an instant, slashing the knife away and digging my nails into his flesh. I ripped his shirt like paper and separated his chest just like he did to me, my piercing screeches ringing into the night until I burrowed so deep they could no longer be heard. He thrashed and oozed from every orifice as he made room for me, just as the cab driver did, and the park ranger before him. I ate and wriggled as he expired, worming and digging my tiny frame to each limb like a suit. When the fit was just right, I stood up and cracked my knuckles. I looked at my reflection in the water, running a hand over my new face to feel the fit. Better than the last one, for sure. I took my time going back to the estate, making sure my walk was just right and everything was in place. The hours passed as I settled in, feeling more and more at home as I worked the joints and muscles. At daybreak, I emerged from the tree line to find Charles on the patio waiting. He came to greet me immediately. "Sir, this one had you out all night. Was this one better than the others? Can I get you something to drink?" "Oh, much better than the last," I replied. "A bourbon, if you will." I've been a fire lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. Mostly, I occupy my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower or scanning the dense trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading back to the nearby ranger station 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep, the road was a harsh ride at the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. "Tower 9. This is Tower 12. Do you copy?" It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my forearm and keyed the microphone attached to my shoulder. "Go for Tower 9, I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw into the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. "John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position?" "Stand by, Billy," I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging to the metal staircase that wound its way around the tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain-link fence surrounding my little compound. Chances were, I'd be back soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that circled the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take an errant step and tumble down through the open hatch. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost instantly. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks each season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like quite a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger that this wilderness presents to anyone not adequately prepared. Some of them have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger or a random hiker might occasionally come across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where people just vanished and left behind a perfectly set-up campsite. No explanation, no clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even kill humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely scenario: folks stepping out of their tents at night to take a piss and very quickly getting lost. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. Tower 9, what's the word? Yeah, I see it, Billy. Looks to be a couple of miles due north of my tower. What's your plan? He asked. I knew what he meant. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I better head over and take a look to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of trekking to that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails heading in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple of miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can feel like 100. Roger that, John, Billy replied. Take your pack and your rifle. Check in periodically. Will do. Tower 9 out, I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack in the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me too far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was well worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and turned the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than expected. A pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it bent, and a massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me ruled out the possibility of going around. I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist suddenly came to mind. We walk from here. Making sure to mark the location of the Jeep on my handheld GPS, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail was heading in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail continued to narrow, as I expected, and before long, I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders as I walked. The trees, which had been alive with the cheering and chirping of animal life near the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. Billy checked in a few times, and I updated him on my progress, promising to maintain regular contact. He advised me that a weather relay from the ranger station had reported an approaching storm, likely to reach us before nightfall. A quick glance at my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I'd predicted. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't be comfortable. If I'd been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but definitely there. I was even more certain of what I'd find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail, I found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, and I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forest, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had belonged to some sort of small settlement. Perhaps an old logging camp, I thought. I didn't know this place even existed, and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy? Billy replied, his voice staticky and distant. Hey, John, Tower 12, what's your status? I frowned and looked around at the towering trees all around me. I suppose I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all. I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp, I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most had collapsed roofs and were barely standing. The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more. There was a pause before Billy spoke again. What's your current location, John? I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position. Another pause. John, I think you should probably just turn back. Come back, okay? You don't have many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks like it's getting worse. Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I couldn't blame him. My safety was his responsibility, and the idea of one of his lookouts being caught out in a storm overnight probably didn't sit well. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either. You may be right, Billy, I replied, turning around and casting my eyes over the area. I'll just head. I stopped as my eyes caught sight of a bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. Repeat your last, John. I didn't get that. Stand by. Tower 12, I said absently, making my way toward what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been completely extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers. Nothing. No one in sight or earshot. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still inside the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. Hello? I called out, turning in a circle. I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone here? Nothing. Just the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath leading toward the slope. In the soft dirt were clearly recent footprints heading away from the camp. I keyed the mic again. Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right? Nothing to be concerned about, Billy answered almost immediately. Roger that, John. Head back home. I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. Just want to check something out first. I wouldn't screw around out there, John, Billy replied, an edge to his voice. Better head back now so you can beat the storm. His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before answering. Acknowledged, I said, knowing full well I was going to check out the path before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor over something so small. Just a quick walk up that path, then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on earlier, but I could clearly see the campers' imprints in the dirt as I went. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had clearly been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years ago, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their deaths in an old, abandoned mine shaft. So it had been a mining camp, not a logging one. I didn't know there were any mines near here. Hell, I wasn't even sure what they could have been mining for. Coal? Maybe gold? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me. Clearly, regardless, now that gate stood wide on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Hell, I couldn't just turn around and leave. One of these dumbass campers had decided it'd be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. This is Tower 12. This is John D. Reed. Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I'd continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. The Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing. But I could at least poke my head inside and see if there were any campers, or hear them, confirm if they went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again, with the same results. I tried a different approach. Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy? I said into the radio. I figured I might be able to at least get Nathan's attention if I was out of range of Billy. Tower 12. There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless going into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to the tower. But I had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with the whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing that I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialized in cave rescues. I should have, but I didn't. I pulled my powerful LED flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I'd taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that short time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside me. It took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was growing cold and damp the further I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in now. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint, and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale. Old. Wrong. It felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence, and then I heard a voice again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Someone there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old. Very old. Maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal. And without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light back up, scanning around the room. "Hello?" I called again. I didn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of this room, mired in darkness. Can you hear me? Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? She asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon my words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clear. The voice of a young man. We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt. Hear me moving around in there? I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. I'm with the Forest Service. It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I shone my light on it, however, it became very clear the reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head, for now. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of blood painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With blood loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they lost their light and got turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. What the hell is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground. Radio for rescue evac. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? All at once, it hit me. The indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized in that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? Repeated the male voice, now even closer. Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. Below the words, I could hear the stealthy sliding of something over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now, but I wasn't going to wait for it to emerge from the darkness. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft. Beyond skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock, scrambling my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, not realizing until I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it was when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of a broken padlock. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little bit better. At least it made me feel a little bit better until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft. Peh, getting closer. It was unmistakable. Uncanny. Hello, can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you. By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of the red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fiercest mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily, driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural, Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. In the first dim light of dawn, as it started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain that I was alone. Once I was satisfied, I was alone for the moment. I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone trying to respond. A combination of the storm and interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. A rifle, no radio, no GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel I was being watched. Do you know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned off the lights in the basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a dark and lonely parking lot? The feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are? It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled trees that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware of every rasping lungful of breath, knowing that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, as pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever hunted my trail to find me. What would happen? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and a stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk, and then reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No. Not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught a flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that this fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though. My feet started forward on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that the forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fenced-in tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise. I realized after a moment, after not hearing back from him, that I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook off the sudden chill as best as I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but that thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a brief flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trap door and let it close behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing through my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair, trimmed clothes. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might sport. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forest Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle, I had had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier. I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual. When in the bush, bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I suppose, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damn lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here, but when I poured and handed him one of the glasses, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire," I repeated. "That old mining camp?" "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out there. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug, a long time before the 19th century at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing." "Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows as if to say, "What an understatement." Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. "Did you find the campers at least?" I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. "No," I said softly. "I tracked them to the mine but lost them in the cave." I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor, and he was out of his chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. "You went into the cave?" he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. "Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. I'm not sure by whom or when." I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. "Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers. I think it followed me out." Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. When he spoke again, it sounded far away and distant. "Utami," he muttered. "That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Blur is what the white man called it, among other names, Kuatami." He nodded. "False brother, lying man, something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like, a translator?" "It means bad," he continued. "No matter what language you speak, it means something's out there that isn't supposed to be, something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten." It was then that he stood and grabbed his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. "I need to get back to my tower and make a call now." I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. "Why not use mine?" Billy shook his head. "Sorry, John. It doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late." I started to stand. "I'll go with you," I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. "No, you stay here, strap on your handgun, and make sure it's loaded." His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out here. "Billy, I can go with you. I can help." I started to argue, but it was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me. And I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. "You will stay in your goddamn tower, and you will follow orders," he roared. I took an unconscious step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaking nod in agreement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted it on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep, 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, it drove off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and dense, impenetrable tree line beyond. That's probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if there was, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that was the last thing I needed for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours, and I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cover to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weather journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I'd lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large. A little larger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the front page. "From the pocket of Andrew Robinson," it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that Andrew Robinson had been keeping. 23rd July, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sequoia Arpani, tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit I was skeptical at the Yar in the old tavern, spun the crowded confines of the common house in Dun Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never gathered a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. 24th July, 1891. Our small troop both intrepid adventurers made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Those cabins likely would have been more comfortable, but I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding in queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typical infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp LeClaire, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We all of us raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nearly invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight, a barricaded tunnel entrance that had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or added dug-in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it. But the professor dismissed the triviality, so the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed any further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. 25th July 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to all of us, foreign to the professor, with whom the Pawnee Tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. 25th July 1891 addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that his bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the added tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and unmoving, but our excitement over this discovery laid any concerns or discomfort this may have caused. The professor directed us to set up a secondary camp in this new chamber, which we'll use as a staging point for further exploration. So, we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies for our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded the start of the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. 26th July, 1891. Another shock. When we woke this morning, O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system in the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again, trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. 27th July 1891. I am at my wit's end, and I'm unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I've seen nothing of our missing companion or the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them for this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment and some reluctance, to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds, by heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I did my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo, which may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. Then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant call of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed. I was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back at me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice, I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern. At that moment, could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He'd always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous people without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I'm not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that'll take its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal to the floor, heart pounding. I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkening thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy, the self-assured authority that filled his tone now strangely absent, replaced with something else, fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "What do you think, Billy? I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no Jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I intended. "I'm not outside your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me. In that moment, I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," it was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12. Barely visible over the darkening blanket of green, was that a gunshot? Another night, another goddamn night stuck in this window-lined prism. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the tower, which was a bit disconcerting to say the least. As I stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack, I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and look every bit as pissed off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the last dry season has come to an end, which is good since I've been slacking a bit on my fire-watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? Due to that, or I'm sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying. I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard Pete from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan and the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with them. Update. I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast, and before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around and deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it's crumbled away into little wet brown bits as soon as I probed it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kwatami or angler thing is, and I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think I haven't heard anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still over there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere over near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me anyways. Which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea. My Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with this wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I could get a straight shot down the service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right down where I am in this tower. And I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days out in the wilderness, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what they'll find when they get here. See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As Pants shittingly terrified as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night, is worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered to my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal, anyways. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work. It's on my side for now. I'm going to try to eat a granola bar to put something in my churning stomach and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link fence into that open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I stood there motionless. Must have been 5 minutes, frozen in place with my hand clenching the grip of my revolver that's holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at how keen my senses seemed in that moment. I felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized that I'd been holding my breath in subconsciously, afraid to make even the smallest sound. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to breathe normally again, scanning the trees. I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal, at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom-used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued for now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Or perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence and found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would it suddenly appear, rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up to me in order to prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it's out there, unmanned, unwatched, and abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path. It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door, hand on the handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver, and I realized then how quiet the forest around me was. I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. Now it was as if they had all left. It felt very alone in that moment, only not quite alone. Somewhere out there, in that sea of trees, something stalked. Something that didn't belong in the light of day. Something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was thankfully quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges. But in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they are the only convenient transportation for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save my sorry ass. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven, and I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got it turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it the way I'd come. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed, so I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Considering the condition of the trail, with the fact that it constantly wound and curved as it progressed, it meant that even my best speed wasn't much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there and be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, I was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like looking at a GPS on it or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly pissed myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had ever expected to hear. "John, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak, strained. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen in indecision, clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned how to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy? Is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John? Thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been there. I got to my Jeep, and I was just about to haul ass for the ranger station when I replied, "What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't even heard me. But then he answered, "I'm not doing too hot, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've lost a lot of blood, and I've been drifting in and out. I've patched myself up as best as I could. I stopped the bleeding for my leg." He frowned and closed his eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. "Are you able to get back to your Jeep?" I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. "I don't think so. Pretty banged up, man. What happened?" "Billy, son of a... It got into my tower, managed to get a shot off, but not before it got a jump on me. I took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's dead." I doubted that. Things never work out that simply. "Are you stable, Billy? Can you be moved?" Another silence, and then he said, "I know what you're thinking, John. Just turn your Jeep around and haul ass to the ranger station. That's an order." I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm an idiot for even thinking it, but I could have been blissfully out of range if he'd only waited for 10 more minutes. Still, I put the throttle down and got the hell out of there. I could still race for the ranger station, have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. It didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he'd last that amount of time. I could still turn left. I'd likely live. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to die alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there, hurt, bleeding out, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably saying already. Don't be a dumbass. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it, believe me. I get it. But this wasn't a movie. My friend was lying there, dying in his shack. If I could get to him and get him into the Jeep, we could both get out of there, leaving this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can, I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here now. Despite the situation, I managed to start a grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the Fire Watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Trying to be a pretty good guess, and before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming from its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement, before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through an open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I kept the mic on my shoulder and said in a low voice, "Billy, I'm outside your tower right now, heading up. For Christ's sake, don't shoot me." I turned the volume on the speaker down just in time for his response. "Damn it, John. I told you to leave." Despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran lightly up the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spots staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous liquid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. God, I hope that thing is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, red blood indicated an arterial bleed, which was typically a fairly significant injury. With this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the stairs around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. "Billy?" I called cautiously. A pause, then came his reply, shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. "How do I know it's you? Say something I couldn't have heard you say before." "I have always admired and respected you," I answered without hesitation. He said under his breath, "Come on up." I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to the side, the stainless steel barrel clanging against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noticed two things immediately. Firstly, there was a significant amount of that black-red goo splattered around. Secondly, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and his face was covered in a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red, but it was his leg that worried me the most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, and he was groaning, but the pants leg was a cherry red below that, glistening in the late morning light. "Jesus, Billy," I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off, saying, "All beside me. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round." I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him into his shack. A twin of my own tower, normally Billy's looked like a war zone now. His table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio on the floor. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength in with mine, and we began the precarious descent through the trapdoor. "Did you at least get to make your phone call?" I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. "Got here just as I was getting ready to. Excusing your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and you were here to help." He looked at me with a shaking astonishment. "Sounded just like you, John." I looked over the catwalk, railing down at it. He winced again as we stumbled on a step. "Almost there, John," he continued. "Well, yeah, I've never seen anything like it." I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground. I grunted with exertion. "Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later." He just nodded as I maneuvered him and ran to the passenger side of the Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side door, got in, started the engine, and pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond. Safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mass, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, damn near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel. In a panic, the Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid slamming into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly. The engine stalled, and everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon the abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with a 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on 4 limbs, clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, and its mottled pink-gray skin stretched taut over muscles, bones, and odd unidentifiable bulges. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what had been claws, but instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails that seemed so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. The worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head, topped with an oddly gaunt-appearing neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline's skull. Its mouth seemed a jagged tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been, instead, there were two bulbous and cyst-like organs, seemingly bulging and flattening in a slow rhythm as if bladders were filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to try to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely severed, hanging limply in contrast to its sibling. A gouge furrowed by the bullet's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head, piercing and ravaging the bulbous organ on that side and leaving it a deflated sac. When it turned its head further in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but I was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, leaving a shiny silver scar to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you, you bastard," Billy whispered, half to himself. The mimic stopped its motion, and we watched as the uninjured bladder on its head expanded like a half-filled party balloon. It dipped its head a bit, and we saw two membranous slits in the top of its skull dilate. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but it was distorted and wrong. I thought that the wound from his gunshot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction. It took a few experimental steps forward, then paused and lowered its head. This time, we heard what sounded like the painful roar of a beast, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. "Killed a bear." I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open, where its nose should have been twitched minutely back and forth, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. "Knows we're here somewhere, but he can't see us," whispered Billy, leaning close. "But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for." I looked over at Billy and realized that there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in our Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, our heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4, and when that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes for a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, sort of acceptance. So he didn't like it one bit. "Get ready with the cannon," he whispered. "Only gonna get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of strength to fling the door open and stagger out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted, limping weakly across the road from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but it was too weak to raise it towards the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and a resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the defining sound of the gunshot, the flap of membrane at its snout snapping shut protectively. But its stunned hesitation didn't last very long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and tearing at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend screaming, then a horrible, soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same moment. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head swung around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch, but I was quicker. The report of the gunshot was incredible, and the recoil from the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of blood and tissue explode from a wound where its shoulder met its neck. It howled an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set on my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry. All I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the horrific thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the bullets had entered, and I knew that the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay sprawled across the ruined body of Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red blood spread out from beneath the thing's bulk like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the slits on the top of its skull. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own Magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from its grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only one unfired round remained. That was enough, though. I approached the horror before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this thing that had caused so much pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic's head, which still convulsed with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I'd seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its skull, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cold steel of the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed throughout the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I'd read, written more than 130 years before, and how it alluded to the tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered was the only one of its kind. That the same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions pursued. It didn't seem likely. And now the door was open.